touch has conditions now," she announced, her voice steady but stripped of warmth. That was the moment I realized what we had was no longer love, but a transaction dressed in the memory of intimacy. What once came freely, what once flowed between us with no hesitation had been reduced to a bargaining chip. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. Instead, I canceled the contract, not on paper, but in spirit, in the quiet but final way a person chooses freedom over compromise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When I tell people about that moment, they usually expect a dramatic scene, yelling, tears, maybe even slamming doors. But that's not how it happened. It was quiet, almost deceptively ordinary, the way life-changing decisions often are. I was sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at the grooves in the wooden floor, when she told me. Her name was Marissa, and for nearly 3 years I thought she was my safe place. She was intelligent, driven, the type of person who could light up a room with her laughter. When I first met her, there was no part of me that could imagine we would end in silence, in negotiations that cheapened the very thing that made us human together. Yet here I am telling you about the night she put conditions on something that was supposed to be unconditional. Before we dive deeper, let me tell you a little about myself. My name is Ethan, 31 years old, working as a systems analyst in a mid-sized firm in Portwell, a city that wasn't remarkable in size but pulsed with a quiet ambition. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't the type to command attention in a crowd, but I had built my life on consistency. My friends would describe me as reliable to a fault, someone who showed up when he said he would, someone who kept his promises even when it cost him. That was the foundation of my identity, and when I loved with that same commitment. Back then, my world looked fairly simple. My mornings started with strong coffee and a 30-minute walk to the office, earbuds in, letting podcasts fill the silence. My evenings were spent at Marissa's apartment, which was always a bit too neat, a bit too curated, as though she lived her life as though someone was grading her performance. At the time, I didn't mind. It felt like she had things together in a way I admired. Looking back, I realize it was part of a larger pattern. Everything with her was conditional, structured, measured. Even the things that should have been spontaneous carried an invisible checklist. But in those first months, before conditions and ultimatums entered the picture, it felt like I had stumbled into something extraordinary. Marissa was captivating, and she had a way of making me believe I was special just by the way she leaned in when I spoke, how she remembered details about my life most people glossed over. That initial spark, that magnetic draw, is what made the eventual unraveling so devastating. Because when the good times are that good, you almost convince yourself you can survive anything that follows. The moment everything changed wasn't the loudest, but it was the most honest. We had just returned from a late dinner, a quiet Italian restaurant tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. She had barely touched her pasta, distracted, her phone lighting up every few minutes with notifications she never explained. Back at her place, I tried to wrap my arms around her the way I always did. That's when she froze, gently but firmly pushing me back. She looked me in the eye and said, "Touch has conditions now, Ethan. We need to have rules." Rules. The word lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. Intimacy wasn't supposed to come with a manual or a ledger. Yet there she was, calmly drawing lines where none had existed before. It wasn't about consent. I respected boundaries and always would. It was about control. It was about taking something organic, something meant to be shared freely, and turning it into a system of checks and balances. That's when the scales tipped, when my quiet certainty about us began to crumble. But let's not rush. To understand why that night hit me so hard, you need to see what came before it. You need to see the version of us that laughed until 2 in the morning, that shared secrets we swore no one else would ever hear, that built dreams about traveling to Italy someday, not just the corner restaurant, but the real streets of Florence. Because without that picture of what we once were, you can't understand what it cost to let it all go. So here's where our story truly begins. In the ordinariness of life before the fracture. In the way routines built walls around us. In the subtle but unmistakable shift from love to leverage. And as I recount it all, you'll see why canceling that unspoken contract wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the beginning of reclaiming myself. When I think back to my life before the cracks began to show, I see a man who believed in structure and safety above all else. My days were marked by predictability, and I clung to that predictability like a lifeline. In Portwell, the city where I lived, there was comfort in the rhythm of the streets, the familiar faces at the corner cafe, the way the same buskers rotated through the plaza outside my office building. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for me, steady meant good. My job as a systems analyst reflected that same mentality. I spent my days identifying problems, creating order out of chaos, and ensuring the gears of my company turned without interruption. I liked solving puzzles, finding patterns, making things fit together neatly. It gave me a sense of control, one that made me feel capable even when the rest of life felt unpredictable. At 31, I wasn't the type of person anyone would describe as reckless. My closest friends, a small but loyal group I'd known since university, often teased me for being the dad of the group, the one who made sure everyone got home safe after a night out, the one who reminded them to check their tires before a road trip, the one who always carried an extra charger in case someone's phone died. I didn't mind the label. If anything, I wore it proudly. It meant I could be relied upon, and in my mind, reliability was the foundation of trust. That was who I was when Marissa came into my life. A man defined by routine, shaped by loyalty, and secretly longing for something to disrupt the monotony without shattering it completely. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom tucked above a florist's shop that kept the air perfumed with roses and lilies. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and every corner bore evidence of the life I had built. Books lined the shelves, some about technology and logic puzzles, others about history and philosophy. I wasn't a minimalist, but I wasn't careless either. Everything had its place. I cooked for myself most nights, simple meals like grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, and I found comfort in the sound of sizzling pans and the ritual of sitting down to eat alone. It wasn't loneliness, at least not then. It was independence, a quiet sense of ownership over my world. That's not to say I didn't want connection. If anything, my desire for it ran deeper because I wasn't someone who filled his time with fleeting distractions. I craved depth, the kind of bond where silence was as meaningful as words, where gestures spoke volumes. When I met Marissa, I thought I had found that. She was different from the women I had dated before. She was meticulous, driven, and polished in a way that felt aspirational. She worked as a marketing strategist for a startup that was just beginning to gain traction, and the energy she poured into her work fascinated me. She had vision, and I admired the way she could take an idea and shape it into something tangible. She often joked that my logical brain balanced out her creative one, and for a while, that balance made me believe we could complement each other in all the right ways. My values back then were simple. I believed love was built on trust, honesty, and loyalty. I didn't think relationships were supposed to be effortless. Every lasting bond in my mind required work, but I also believed that work was supposed to come from a place of willingness, not obligation. You chose to give, you chose to care, and the beauty of it was in the freedom of that choice. That belief was deeply ingrained in me, shaped by watching my parents navigate their own imperfect but enduring marriage. They fought sometimes, sure, but they always came back to the table, always chose each other in the end. To me, that was the kind of love worth striving for. Not flawless, but resilient. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I carried those ideals into my relationship with Marissa. I approached it with patience, with consistency, with the belief that if I gave my best, she would meet me halfway. And for a long time, that seemed to be true. She laughed at my corny jokes, teased me for my habit of double-checking locks, and introduced me to parts of the city I had overlooked. She had a way of making the ordinary feel exciting, and in return, I offered her a stability she said she had never known before. It was a trade that felt fair, a balance that worked, until it didn't. At this point in my life, before the shift toward ultimatums and conditions, I thought I had achieved what many people spend years searching for: a stable job, loyal friends, a comfortable home, and a partner who seemed to understand me. It wasn't a storybook romance, but it felt real, and real was enough. I didn't see the cracks forming, didn't recognize the subtle ways control was replacing care, because I was too busy holding on to the idea that consistency would save us. My identity as someone reliable, steady, and loyal made me blind to the fact that not everyone values those traits in the same way. To truly understand what was at stake when she uttered those words, "Touch has conditions now," you have to see the man I was before. I wasn't naive, but I was hopeful. I wasn't reckless, but I was trusting. I wasn't weak, but I was willing to bend in the name of love. That willingness, that blind faith in the power of loyalty, is what set the stage for everything that followed. Because when your entire identity rests on the belief that love is unconditional, the shock of discovering otherwise doesn't just shatter your relationship, it shakes the very foundation of who you believe yourself to be. Looking back, the beginning of my relationship with Marissa felt like stumbling into a scene painted perfectly for someone like me, someone who had spent years in order and quiet observation, suddenly thrust into a world that shimmered with possibility. I first met her at a small networking event in downtown Portwell, a gathering that combined local entrepreneurs, artists, and tech enthusiasts. It was the kind of event I would normally approach with caution, scanning the room quietly before deciding if I even wanted to interact. But that evening, something pulled me toward her without conscious thought. She stood near the refreshments table, scrolling through her phone with the kind of focus that made you curious about what could occupy someone so completely. When I accidentally bumped into her while reaching for a cup of water, she looked up, and there it was, the spark. The kind of spark that makes you forget the mundane world for a brief moment. The kind that hints at stories waiting to be written. Her name, Marissa, rolled off my tongue before I even asked it. She smiled, a small, confident curve of her lips that held no pretension, and that first conversation began with something as simple as the quality of the coffee at the venue. From there, the dialogue grew effortlessly, weaving through shared jokes, subtle teasing, and stories from our lives that we revealed almost instinctively. I remember thinking how unusual it was for someone to talk to me with that kind of attention, the way she didn't just hear my words but seemed to listen for the spaces between them. That night ended with a casual exchange of numbers, yet as I walked home, I felt a mixture of excitement and disbelief, the kind that comes when life offers an unexpected opportunity to feel truly seen. The next few weeks followed a rhythm I now recognize as dangerously seductive. We met for coffee dates, museum walks, and long conversations at the little park near the river, where street musicians played violins every weekend. Marissa had a way of introducing me to aspects of myself I hadn't acknowledged, drawing out humor, curiosity, and a sense of adventure I had long buried under responsibility. I began to anticipate her messages, the witty banter and thoughtful questions that made me feel alive in ways my ordered life rarely allowed. Her apartment became a frequent destination, and I found myself staying later than I ever intended, lingering not because of obligation, but because every moment with her seemed to matter in a way nothing else had. At the same time, there were subtle markers that hinted at her nature, the meticulousness in her planning, the small ways she seemed to measure reactions and gauge responses. But in the beginning, those markers felt like quirks rather than warnings. She was someone who had clearly succeeded in her career, and she carried that precision into her personal life. She liked to organize our outings in advance, map out conversations we might have, and even suggested books for me to read that aligned with her worldview. At first, I admired it. It made me feel guided, like being in a relationship was more than just coincidence. It was a partnership where two people consciously built something together. I didn't yet see that the same traits that made her efficient and captivating could also, in time, be used as tools for control. One of the defining moments of those early days came during a weekend trip to the coastal town of Linden Bay, a place neither of us had visited before. We rented a small seaside cabin, complete with creaking wooden floors and a balcony that overlooked the restless waves. It was a perfect getaway, filled with laughter, clumsy attempts at cooking, and late-night walks along the moonlit beach. I remember thinking how effortless it all felt, like two puzzle pieces finding a fit we didn't know we needed. We shared hopes, dreams, and fears in the quiet of the cabin, and in the glow of a single lantern it felt like we had created a world separate from everything else. Those moments, innocent and beautiful, are what made the later betrayal sting so much harder. Because when the start of something feels magical, the shift toward restrictions and conditions feels all the more brutal. During that period, I began to see myself through her eyes in ways that were intoxicating. She complimented my reliability, praised my patience, and even challenged me to break out of my routines in ways that didn't feel threatening. I attempted new hobbies because she suggested them, visited restaurants off my usual path, and allowed myself small indulgences simply because she encouraged them. The relationship was, at that point, a series of carefully constructed moments that seemed spontaneous yet grounded in mutual understanding. I had never imagined that what felt like freedom and exploration could, in time, become a cage of obligations and expectations. Looking back, the seeds of the problems were already planted in those early months, though I didn't see them. They were in the subtle calculations behind her compliments, in the way she occasionally measured my reactions before offering affection, in the quiet questions that probed my limits without ever saying so directly. At the time, I mistook them for attentiveness, for care, for a desire to understand me more deeply. But as the relationship unfolded, those same seeds grew into boundaries that were conditional rather than collaborative. And yet, even as those small patterns emerged, I was too enchanted by the brightness of the beginning to notice the shadows gathering at the edges. In essence, the beginning of our story was intoxicating because it offered the illusion of complete harmony. It was the calm before the storm, the golden phase that makes the storm feel inevitable yet unimaginable. It was a time when every glance, every conversation, every shared moment felt significant, as if the universe itself had conspired to align our paths. And it is precisely that allure, that feeling of having discovered something rare and extraordinary, that made the unraveling so devastating. The start of us wasn't just a chapter in my life, it was the lens through which all that came after would be measured, a reference point for the betrayal and disillusionment that eventually forced me to cancel the unspoken contract that had defined our intimacy. The good times with Marissa were not flashy or extravagant. They were moments stitched together with laughter, warmth, and a sense of belonging that felt almost unreal in its simplicity. In those days, life seemed to hum with a quiet joy, the kind that doesn't announce itself but quietly settles into the bones and makes you feel whole. We had a weekend ritual, one that began with early morning walks in Hawthorne Park, a sprawling green space in the heart of the city, where the sun would cast soft golden streaks through the trees, and the sounds of birds and distant traffic blended into a comforting backdrop. We would talk about everything and nothing, career goals, old childhood memories, dreams for the future, or sometimes just the random absurdities of life. She had a way of making even mundane details seem interesting, drawing you into her orbit with an energy that was both calming and electrifying. We shared meals at little hole-in-the-wall cafes, often sitting at the same corner table by the window. The waitstaff would recognize us after a few visits, greeting us with familiarity, and Marissa always made a point of thanking everyone we met, not just out of politeness, but because she genuinely seemed to care. Those small gestures, which now I can see were part of her meticulous attention to appearances and impressions, felt like proof of her kindness at the time. Evenings often ended on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker to life as we sipped wine or tea. We would lean into each other, sharing quiet moments of touch, hugs, and whispered jokes. In retrospect, it's clear that the freedom of touch, the spontaneous closeness, the unspoken comfort, was something I came to take for granted, yet at the time, it felt natural, unremarkable in its consistency, and therefore priceless. One of the peaks of those good times came during our first vacation together to Ashford Hills, a small lakeside town 2 hours outside Portwell. We rented a tiny cabin with a wraparound deck, its windows overlooking the water, which shimmered under the sun in colors I can still recall vividly. Days were filled with kayaking, hiking along trails flanked by pine trees, and cooking simple meals together in the cabin's rustic kitchen. We laughed over spilled soup, over failed attempts to start a fire in the outdoor pit, and over our mutual inability to agree on the correct way to pack for a weekend getaway. At night, we would sit under a blanket, staring at the stars, listening to the quiet lapping of the lake against the shore, and it felt as if nothing could intrude upon that fragile, perfect world we had created. Those nights, when the air was crisp and the only sound was the soft rhythm of water and wind, remain some of the most peaceful memories of my life. In Portwell, even small daily routines carried the same sense of magic. Marissa and I would grab lunch together whenever our schedules allowed, often trying new restaurants tucked into alleys or behind unmarked doors, discovering hidden culinary gems. On rainy afternoons, we would sit by the large windows of her apartment, watching the city glisten under wet asphalt and neon signs, sharing stories about our families, our childhood fears, and the ambitions that drove us forward. She had a way of making ordinary experiences feel curated, meaningful, as if every moment we spent together was a piece of a mosaic that only we could understand. That feeling of intimacy, being understood, being valued, being consistently acknowledged, was intoxicating, and it built a sense of loyalty in me that I would later realize made me vulnerable to her conditional boundaries. The tactile moments, the physical connection, were perhaps the most potent of the good times. The way she would lean into me while we walked down the street, fingers brushing in casual closeness, the quiet comfort of her hand finding mine when we sat together in silence, the warmth of her head resting on my shoulder during movies or quiet nights. These were the threads that wove together a sense of belonging. At the time, they felt effortless, natural, and free, but in hindsight, they were fragile because they relied entirely on mutual trust and goodwill, which eventually proved conditional rather than guaranteed. We also shared dreams, big, audacious ones. We talked about buying a small loft in a quieter neighborhood of the city, where we could each have our own workspace but also a shared studio for creative projects. We imagined traveling, not just for fun, but to immerse ourselves in art, history, and culture. She wanted to see Florence, I wanted to hike the Andes, and together we plotted out itineraries that seemed both ambitious and achievable. Those discussions were peppered with laughter and playful debates over details, yet they carried an undercurrent of hope that made the day-to-day struggles of life seem insignificant. Those hopes, dreams, and shared plans created a sense of investment that made the eventual erosion of trust all the more devastating. Even conflict, when it arose, was minor in those early good times. Disagreements were short-lived, followed by apologies and laughter. If she teased me for being overly cautious, I'd counter with jokes about her being a perfectionist. We rarely fought, and when we did, it felt constructive, a dialogue rather than a battle. That balance made me believe we could withstand any storm, that the foundation we were building was resilient. And yet, as is often the case, it was precisely this sense of security, this comfort, that masked the subtle shifts that would eventually tip everything into imbalance. The good times were intoxicating because they were consistent, tangible, and emotionally nourishing. They created a sense of normalcy that felt rare and precious, giving me the illusion that nothing could shake us. That illusion, however, became a double-edged sword. When the moment came that conditions replaced spontaneity, when the freedom of touch and closeness became negotiable, the contrast was so stark it almost knocked me off my feet. But in order to understand the weight of that fall, you need to first see the height of the climb. The joy, intimacy, and love that existed before boundaries were imposed, and the human connection was redefined as conditional. The first warning signs appeared not with a confrontation or a dramatic argument, but in quiet, almost imperceptible ways that only became glaring in retrospect. At first, I chalked them up to stress or the pressures of her job, convincing myself that Marissa's meticulousness and occasional coldness were temporary, situational, nothing to worry about. But as days turned into weeks, small fissures began to form, each subtle moment a precursor to the larger fracture that would eventually redefine our relationship. It began with gestures that seemed minor but carried meaning. A delayed response to a message that once would have been answered immediately, a sharp tone in a sentence that normally would have carried warmth, the occasional sigh that lingered longer than comfort should allow. Each of these instances on its own might have been negligible, but together they hinted at a shift in her approach to us. I remember one particular evening when we met for dinner at Claremont Bistro, a cozy spot we frequented. Marissa had been unusually distant during the drive, scrolling through her phone and giving short, clipped answers to questions that previously would have sparked lively conversation. At the table, she barely made eye contact, picking at her salad while I talked about a project at work that I was excited about. Finally, she said, almost casually, "You know, Ethan, I don't think we should just assume things anymore. Some things need to be earned." I paused mid-bite, unsure what she meant. Was she referring to my affection, my attention, or the very intimacy we had always shared freely? I tried to laugh it off, teasing her about being dramatic, but inside, a small alarm bell had begun to ring. The carefree spontaneity of touch, of closeness, of emotional openness, was starting to feel like it required permission. Around the same time, I noticed her becoming more controlling in subtle ways that were easy to rationalize. She suggested we follow a more rigid schedule for our weekends, deciding in advance which activities were acceptable and which were not. She began questioning my interactions with friends and colleagues, under the guise of concern or curiosity, though her tone carried an unmistakable weight of judgment. I found myself second-guessing minor decisions, whether to meet a friend for coffee or attend a networking event without her, because her expressions of disapproval, even when quiet, had an effect on me. It was a slow erosion, a gradual encroachment of limitations that were presented as preferences but felt increasingly like boundaries designed to control rather than nurture. Physical affection, which had once been natural and mutual, began to show subtle signs of conditionality. I noticed her hesitation when I reached out to hold her hand in public or brush against her shoulder, small pauses that never came with explanations. A playful touch that had previously drawn smiles and laughter now occasionally elicited a tight-lipped response or a polite but firm pullback. At first, I rationalized this as fatigue, stress, or perhaps she simply needed personal space, but a creeping unease took root in my chest. The intimacy that had defined our connection was becoming transactional in ways I couldn't yet articulate, and I started to question whether I had misunderstood the meaning of her gestures all along. The emotional distance was accompanied by subtle manipulation in conversation. She would ask questions about my schedule, my thoughts, my decisions, often framing them as curiosity, but the undertone was always evaluative. There was a sharpness to the way she pressed for answers, a sense that I was being tested against some invisible standard I couldn't quite identify. The warning signs weren't loud. They were in the pauses, in the unspoken expectations, in the way a joke about my habits could suddenly feel like criticism rather than affection. And yet, I stayed, because the good times were still there, shimmering like fragile glass in my memory, making me reluctant to acknowledge the cracks, for fear that doing so would shatter them completely. One night, while we were watching a movie at her apartment, she suddenly turned to me and said, "Ethan, I think we need to talk about how we show affection. There are rules now." The words hung in the air, startling me, though she delivered them with a casual tone, as though it were nothing extraordinary, but I felt my chest tighten. What did it mean for the physical closeness we had always taken for granted? Was there a threshold I had unknowingly crossed? Was every touch from that point forward going to carry a price or expectation? I wanted to ask, to probe, to clarify, but I hesitated, unsure if I would hear the answer I feared. That evening, the first unmistakable boundary was drawn, and with it, the first clear warning that the relationship I thought I knew was shifting into a new, unfamiliar territory. The accumulation of these small signs, subtle gestures, and cautious words created a tension that was difficult to confront directly. On one hand, I loved Marissa, and the memories of our laughter, our shared adventures, and our dreams made it hard to question her motives. On the other hand, my instincts, honed by years of observing patterns and understanding human behavior, whispered that something was fundamentally changing. The warning signs weren't catastrophic in isolation, but together, they formed a pattern that hinted at a deeper, more restrictive dynamic. I began to feel as though I was navigating a minefield, where every misstep could be interpreted as a failure to meet conditions I didn't fully understand. Those early warning signs were a turning point because they forced me to begin questioning not just the relationship, but my own expectations, boundaries, and sense of self. I was beginning to see that love, when coupled with hidden rules and unspoken demands, could become a cage, and that the first whispers of control, however subtle, were often the most telling. What I didn't know then was that these were only the first cracks in a dam that would eventually burst, and that recognizing them now, before the full collapse, would be the difference between losing myself entirely and reclaiming my autonomy when the moment came. After the first warning signs, the relationship began to evolve, or perhaps devolve, in ways that I hadn't anticipated. What had once been subtle hints of control became more explicit demands, and the sense of ease and mutual respect that had characterized the good times gradually eroded under the weight of rules and expectations. Every interaction now carried an invisible ledger, a sense that my every choice, gesture, or comment could be measured against some unstated standard. Marissa's words, once playful or affectionate, now carried an undercurrent of judgment. It was no longer just about small preferences. It was about control, a slow tightening that began to make me feel constrained within the very life I had chosen to share with her. It started with minor criticisms, delivered in a tone that suggested concern but felt like surveillance. "Ethan, you shouldn't be texting her. It gives the wrong impression," she would say, referring to a colleague I had worked with for years. "You need to be more careful about what you post online. It's not just your image anymore, it's ours." Initially, I rationalized her comments as protective, as someone trying to help me maintain boundaries in our partnership. But soon, the guidance became prescriptive, dictating how I should behave, what I should say, and even how I should think about myself. The spontaneity I had taken for granted, the very essence of freedom that had drawn me to her, was being replaced by a constant need to calculate, evaluate, and anticipate her reactions. Physical affection, too, became a battleground. The natural gestures that had defined our intimacy were now accompanied by conditions. A hug, once simple and comforting, required permission. A kiss needed justification, a touch measured and analyzed. The warmth I had associated with closeness was now tainted with anxiety, and I found myself pausing before any physical interaction, asking silently if I was allowed to bridge the space between us. Marissa introduced boundaries that were specific and rigid, often citing personal reasons that seemed rational on the surface but were really extensions of control. The intimacy that had once felt effortless now carried strings, and each time I acquiesced to a restriction, I felt a fragment of my own freedom slipping away. The escalation wasn't limited to rules about affection or social interactions. It began to invade our daily lives in unexpected ways. She scrutinized my routine, questioned my priorities, and imposed timelines for decisions that were once mine alone. "We need to talk about what's acceptable for the weekend," she would say, and suddenly every plan I had made, every spontaneous thought, needed approval. Invitations from friends became negotiations. Personal choices became subjects for debate. I started to feel like an employee in a position I had not applied for, responsible not just for myself but for meeting her evolving checklist of expectations. The tension created by these escalating problems was compounded by emotional manipulation. Marissa had a way of framing her demands as concern or necessity, often leaving me doubting my own perception of reality. "I just want what's best for us," she would say, softening the blow of another restrictive rule. But beneath the veneer of care, there was an unmistakable assertion of power. I began to recognize the pattern. Affection and connection were being used as tools, privileges that could be granted or withdrawn, depending on compliance with her increasingly exacting standards. And because I had invested so deeply in the relationship, I felt compelled to comply, hoping to restore the ease we had once shared, only to find the goalposts shifting constantly. Even conversations became a minefield. Topics that had once been light and enjoyable now carried hidden expectations. I found myself monitoring my words, anticipating criticism, and avoiding certain subjects entirely to prevent triggering disputes. A simple discussion about a weekend trip could spiral into a debate about schedules, priorities, and permissions, leaving me emotionally drained. Marissa's tone, once warm and teasing, had transformed into something clinical, almost calculating, as though every interaction was part of a larger evaluation of my behavior. The more I tried to understand her perspective, the more I realized that the patterns of escalation were intentional. Each new rule, each subtle manipulation, designed to reinforce her control over the relationship. The social dimension also became more pronounced. Friends began noticing the changes in our dynamic, often expressing concern in ways I initially resisted. Invitations from friends were met with subtle discouragement. Casual outings became sources of tension. Shared experiences with others were scrutinized and criticized. The very support system that once celebrated our happiness now highlighted the widening gap between who I was and who she wanted me to be. I struggled to reconcile these external observations with my desire to preserve the life we had built, feeling torn between loyalty to her and loyalty to myself. The tipping point, though not yet reached, was approaching through a cumulative effect. The constant scrutiny, the conditional touch, the rigid rules, and the emotional strain created an environment that was suffocating without being overtly violent or explosive. I felt as if I were trapped in a relationship that demanded compliance at the expense of authenticity, where love was no longer mutual but transactional, and every gesture carried implicit obligations. The man I had once been, reliable, confident, and autonomous, was beginning to feel like a shadow of himself, weighed down by invisible chains that were tightened one subtle rule at a time. It was in this period, the escalation phase, that I first began to contemplate the possibility of walking away, not out of anger or passion, but from a quiet, growing recognition that the structure we were building together was not sustainable. The love that had once felt effortless was now entwined with obligations I could not, in good conscience, continue to meet. The escalating problems were no longer small cracks. They were fractures forming along the core of our connection, and I knew, even before the breaking point arrived, that the relationship was moving toward a point of inevitable reckoning. The first time someone outside of the relationship pointed out what I had begun to sense but refused to acknowledge, it felt like a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. My closest friend Lena had been with me through every stage of my life. College misadventures, first heartbreaks, career milestones. And she had a keen sense of when I was pretending everything was fine while the truth was quietly unraveling. One evening, over the faint hum of the late-night cafe where we often met, I confided in her about Marissa's rules and boundaries, about the conditional nature of affection that had begun to weigh on me. Lena listened, eyebrows furrowed in concentration, before she said softly, "Ethan, that's not normal. Love isn't a ledger you keep. You're bending yourself into shapes just to fit into her expectations, and it's not fair to you." Her words struck like lightning, not because they were harsh, but because they were honest. And honesty was something I desperately needed but had been avoiding. It wasn't just Lena who noticed the changes. Other friends and colleagues began to observe the subtle cracks forming in my demeanor. My laughter, once easy and frequent, had become guarded. My presence, once fully engaged in social settings, now carried a weight of tension. Invitations to casual outings were occasionally met with hesitation, as if each decision had become a negotiation with an invisible force dictating what was, quote, 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 quote. People who knew me well began asking gentle questions. "Are you okay with Marissa? You seem different lately." At first, I deflected, laughing it off, insisting that stress from work was likely the cause. But these observations, repeated over time, formed a pattern of validation that I couldn't ignore. I wasn't imagining the shift. It was real, and others could see it too. Lena, in particular, became my sounding board for the most difficult realizations. During one long conversation at her apartment, I recounted a recent weekend where Marissa had imposed strict conditions on everything from what I wore to how long I spent on my own projects. She had even dictated the number of texts I could exchange with family members, framing it as efficiency and prioritization. As I spoke, Lena's expression grew increasingly concerned. "Ethan," she said, leaning forward, "this isn't about her being quirky or organized. She's drawing lines around you that didn't exist before. She's testing how much control she can exert, and the fact that you're bending yourself to meet those rules is a red flag." Hearing her articulate the patterns I had been too polite or hopeful to acknowledge was both terrifying and liberating. It gave language to the confusion that had been gnawing at me silently. It was also around this time that my cousin Jared, who had endured his own difficult relationship, shared his perspective. Over coffee in a quiet corner of Maple Street Cafe, he told me, "Ethan, what you're describing isn't love. It's manipulation dressed up as rules. You can pretend it's normal, but when the rules start dictating the smallest parts of your life, it's no longer about connection, it's about control." Jared's words echoed in my mind long after our meeting, reinforcing the internal conflict I had been experiencing. Here were people who cared for me, who had no stake in the minutiae of my relationship, yet they were seeing the dynamics clearly, without the filters of affection, hope, or fear that I had been operating under. What struck me most was the consistency across voices, Lena's, Jared's, even casual acquaintances, observations aligned in subtle ways. They all pointed to a reality I had resisted facing. Marissa's conditional approach to intimacy and behavior was not an anomaly, a quirky habit, or a temporary phase. It was a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, are difficult to ignore. Their perspectives helped me frame my own experience, not as personal failure or weakness, but as a structural issue within the relationship itself. The clarity that came from these external validations was both terrifying and necessary, because it forced me to see the situation from a vantage point I couldn't achieve alone. Even my therapist, whom I had been seeing for months to manage stress and maintain perspective, confirmed what my friends had hinted at. During a session, I described the rules, the conditional touch, the emotional micromanagement that had become a daily reality. She nodded thoughtfully, writing a few notes before speaking. "Ethan, what you're describing is consistent with emotional coercion. You're in a relationship where your autonomy is increasingly restricted under the guise of care. It's not subtle miscommunication, it's a pattern that undermines your sense of self. Hearing those words from a professional with no emotional attachment to the relationship was jarring. It validated what my friends had said, what my instincts had whispered, and what my gut had increasingly felt. The life I was living was no longer aligned with the values, freedom, and respect that had defined who I was. The external validation became a turning point in how I processed the relationship. I began to recognize that the unease, frustration, and subtle fear I had been experiencing were not personal shortcomings or imagined anxieties. They were real, and they were being amplified by someone I loved, placing conditions on basic human intimacy. The support system I had around me provided not only perspective but also courage, a necessary foundation for the next stage of reckoning. Their recognition of the problem gave me the strength to name it, to understand its gravity, and to consider the possibility that the solution might involve separation rather than compromise. By the time I reached this stage, I realized that external validation wasn't just comforting, it was essential. Alone, I might have continued to rationalize the restrictions, to hope that love would eventually smooth over the cracks. But with the voices of those who cared for me, I could see the pattern clearly. The conditional affection, the rigid rules, the slow erosion of my autonomy. It was all real, and I no longer had to face it in isolation. These external confirmations didn't provide the solution, but they illuminated the path forward, preparing me to confront the ultimate truth that some contracts, no matter how deeply embedded in memory or emotion, are meant to be canceled. The realization hit me not in a single dramatic moment, but as a cumulative weight pressing on my chest, a quiet suffocation that made even ordinary life feel unbearable. It began on an otherwise normal Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that should have carried the ordinary comfort of routine, but instead brought clarity in the harshest way. I had returned from work, expecting to unwind with Marissa as we had done countless times before, only to find the apartment suffused with a tense atmosphere that made the familiar space feel alien. She was seated on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and without preamble she said, "Ethan, we need to talk about touch." Her words, calm yet unwavering, immediately put me on edge. I knew she was referring not to a single gesture but to an entire pattern of our physical and emotional connection. The conditions she imposed were no longer subtle. They were explicit, inflexible, and undeniably controlling. She outlined what was acceptable and what was not, where we could hug, when we could hold hands, even the moments when eye contact was considered too forward or intimate. Each restriction was rationalized with logic that sounded reasonable in isolation, yet when strung together it became a complex web of prohibitions that left me feeling like a trespasser in my own life. I tried to negotiate, to ask for clarification, to reclaim even a small measure of the freedom we once shared, but every attempt was met with polite firmness, a reminder that her rules were non-negotiable. For the first time, the man who had prided himself on patience, understanding, and loyalty felt powerless. The affection that had once been spontaneous and mutual now came with a ledger of conditions, and the realization that this was not temporary, not a phase, but a deliberate restructuring of intimacy, struck me like a cold wave crashing over my head. It wasn't just the rules themselves that hurt, it was the underlying message that my worth, my capacity to connect, and my right to express care and closeness were conditional. The very foundation of our relationship, the mutual trust, the shared vulnerability, was being replaced by a transactional dynamic where every gesture, every touch, required approval. I sat there, stunned, as the enormity of it sank in. The good times, the laughter, the warmth, the vacations, the small moments that had once defined us, they were all filtered through a lens of negotiation and calculation now. The man who had believed love was a space of mutual freedom was confronted with the stark truth. This love demanded a contract I had never signed. The emotional weight of this realization spilled into every corner of my being. Sleep became elusive. Every night I lay awake replaying moments I had once cherished, now dissecting them under the harsh light of conditionality. Touch, once a natural expression of affection, became a symbol of restriction and control. I began to notice patterns I had previously ignored. The way she subtly criticized spontaneity, the way she questioned my interactions with friends. The way she framed her expectations as care, while systematically eroding my autonomy. Each observation, once rationalized, now struck with the force of undeniable truth. The relationship in its current state was no longer a partnership. It was a structure built to constrain, and I was trapped within it. That week, I found myself walking through Riverside Park, alone, trying to make sense of the storm of emotions within me. The city lights reflected on the river's surface, fractured like the thoughts in my mind. I remembered how easy and effortless things had once been, how touch, laughter, and shared dreams had flowed naturally, and I felt the cruel weight of their absence now. Friends, voices, therapists, observations, and my own growing awareness converged into a single, undeniable conclusion. I could not continue living under these conditions without losing myself entirely. Every rule she imposed, every boundary she drew, chipped away at the man I had been, replacing confidence and joy with anxiety, self-doubt, and quiet despair. The clarity that came in that park was paradoxical, terrifying in its implications, yet liberating in its honesty. I realized that love, when it demands compliance at the expense of identity, is no longer love. It is a mechanism of control. I recognized that the contract she had effectively written, binding me to conditions I had never agreed to, was not something I could honor without sacrificing my autonomy, my dignity, and my emotional well-being. The truth hit like a lightning bolt. I had a choice, stark and unavoidable. I could continue to submit, shrinking myself to fit within the confines of her expectations, or I could step away, reclaiming the freedom that had once defined my existence. By the end of that evening, sitting on the park bench as the night deepened and the city grew quiet, I felt the weight of inevitability. The man who had tolerated subtle manipulations, who had rationalized conditional rules, who had hoped for a return to the good times, finally saw the truth clearly. The final straw, the culmination of all the warnings, all the escalating restrictions, all the subtle erosion of mutual trust, had arrived. I was at rock bottom, not in despair, not in anger, but in the profound, inescapable realization that continuing the relationship under these terms was incompatible with the life I wanted to lead. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was a matter of survival for my own sense of self. In that moment of final clarity, I understood that hope for change, for a return to what had been, was no longer sufficient. The conditions were not temporary or arbitrary. They were entrenched, deliberate, and inflexible. The intimacy, freedom, and trust I had once cherished were now contingent on compliance, and compliance at such a cost was unacceptable. I left the park that night with a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve, carrying the weight of what had been, but also the clarity of what must be done. The contract was unspoken, but its terms were clear, and so too was the realization that I could and must cancel it. The morning after that night in Riverside Park, I awoke with a mixture of dread and relief, knowing that the choice I had been avoiding for weeks could no longer be postponed. The clarity of my realization had crystallized overnight into decisive action. I could no longer participate in a relationship where affection, touch, and basic human connection came with conditions. The good times we had shared, the laughter, the vacations, the quiet evenings on her balcony, were now memories framed by the stark understanding that continuing would demand a surrender of my own identity. I felt a profound need to reclaim the life that had once been mine, free from the rules and measures that had gradually replaced trust and intimacy. I began by setting clear boundaries, both with myself and with Marissa. I spent the morning writing down exactly what I was willing to accept and what I was no longer prepared to compromise. Every stipulation, every small concession was weighed against my sense of autonomy and emotional well-being. The act of writing it all down gave me structure and confidence, transforming the fog of anxiety into a precise map of action. By the time she returned home from work, I had rehearsed the conversation in my mind countless times, balancing firmness with calmness, ready to deliver the truth without blame or drama, knowing that the integrity of my self-respect was at stake. When Marissa walked through the door, I greeted her calmly, as if the ordinary rhythm of our day had not been interrupted by weeks of tension and unease. She noticed my demeanor immediately, the steadiness in my posture, the absence of hesitation in my movements. We sat together on the couch, the same couch where weeks of conditional touch had quietly eroded intimacy, and I began to speak. I explained, without anger or accusation, how her imposition of rules and conditional boundaries had affected me, the suffocating weight of approvals for simple gestures, the erosion of trust, and the strain of constantly evaluating my behavior against invisible standards. I didn't seek to attack. I simply articulated the truth as I had come to understand it. Her initial response was surprise, a slight narrowing of the eyes, and a pause that seemed to stretch the air between us. I could see her trying to frame a response, to rationalize, to assert her perspective, but I had rehearsed this for weeks. I listened, acknowledging her points without debate, and then gently but firmly stated my decision. The relationship could no longer continue under these conditions. I was reclaiming my autonomy, my right to connect freely, and my freedom to exist without measured compliance. The words were both terrifying and liberating as they left my mouth, a declaration not of malice but of self-preservation. The execution of that decision was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no public confrontations, no explosive drama. Instead, it was deliberate, measured, and purposeful. I packed a few belongings I had left at her apartment over the past months and said my goodbyes with clarity and kindness. Each step, each movement, was an exercise in reclaiming control over my own life. The act of leaving, though emotionally taxing, was accompanied by a sense of empowerment that I had not felt in months. It was a confirmation that freedom, even when painful, was infinitely preferable to a conditional love that demanded constant negotiation of my worth and intimacy. In the days following, I returned to the routines and spaces I had once taken for granted but had neglected under the weight of tension and rules. Morning runs through Hawthorne Park, casual coffee with friends, and evenings spent alone with a book or music became acts of restoration. I allowed myself to touch freely, to hug friends without hesitation, to sit close to someone without calculating whether it was permitted. Every ordinary moment, previously loaded with anxiety, now felt rich with reclaimed life. The joy of living on my own terms, even in solitude, was a revelation. I discovered again the comfort of being unmeasured, the delight of expressing affection without conditions, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my choices were entirely my own. Reflection became an essential part of my healing process. I thought deeply about the lessons embedded in the experience. How conditional love, no matter how alluring, can quietly erode autonomy. How early warning signs, subtle shifts in behavior, hesitation, small impositions are crucial indicators of larger patterns, and how external validation from friends, family, and mentors can provide the clarity needed to confront uncomfortable truths. I understood that the contract I had canceled was never a literal document, but a set of unspoken obligations that had gradually replaced genuine connection with control. Recognizing this allowed me to forgive myself for staying longer than I should have, while also affirming the importance of reclaiming boundaries and self-respect before it is too late. Now, months later, I look back at the entire experience with both humility and gratitude. Humility, because it revealed the vulnerabilities in my own approach to love, my willingness to accommodate another at the expense of myself, and my blind spots in interpreting early warning signs. Gratitude, because I survived it, learned from it, and emerged stronger, with a deeper understanding of what constitutes a healthy, mutual connection. Freedom, I realized, is not merely the absence of restriction. It is the ability to engage in life fully, authentically, and without conditional approval. That lesson, once learned, remains a guiding principle in every relationship, friendship, and personal decision I make. Ultimately, canceling the contract was not a defeat. It was an affirmation of my worth and my right to experience love that is reciprocal, free, and unconditional. By choosing to step away from what had become toxic, I created space for genuine growth, trust, and connection to enter my life. And now, when I think of Marissa, I do so without resentment, only clarity. The story of conditional touch, of boundaries imposed and freedom reclaimed, serves as a testament to the power of self-awareness, the necessity of external support, and the transformative courage that comes from recognizing when enough is enough and taking decisive action to reclaim one's life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.